Sechus Bava Kamma daf kuf yud tes is the last daf in the Masechta, contains one Mishnah, the last Mishnah in the Masechta, and we're still discussing the topic of stolen property and when you're allowed to buy from someone who's likely to have stolen property with him, or selling things which he's most likely not allowed to sell. So let's begin. The Gemara has seen in our last Mishnah that you're not supposed to buy wood or fruit from a person who's a shomer on fruit orchards, and that's because he's probably selling the fruit or the branches which belong to the owner of the orchard and are not his. So the Gemara quotes an incident that happened. The name we have here is Rav, but the Mefarshim say it's Rava. Rava bought a bundle of branches from an oris. Oris is a sharecropper, somebody who works a field or an orchard in exchange for a percentage of the produce. So it's not his trees. So Abaye asked how you allowed to take that. We learned in our Mishnah you're not allowed to buy fruits or branches from somebody who guards and watches fruit trees. So he answered, Rava answered, that's only if he's just a shomer. He's not an ars. An ars has a percentage. So since he owns a percentage of the fruits and of the trees, therefore you can say that what he's selling he had a right to sell. If part of it he has a right to sell, you can assume that the one that he's selling is actually the one that he has a right to sell, and it's not stolen property. The Gemara quotes a Brisa. Brisa says, people who guard fruits, like we saw in the Mishnah, you're not supposed to buy from them, but you are allowed to buy from them if they are sitting in a market and they have baskets full of fruit and they're selling in scales. Since they're doing a public sale, you could assume that it's not stolen. People don't sell a stolen problem before Hesi like that. Now, we saw in our Mishnah that if he says hide them, if he tells you to hide them, then you're not allowed to, because then it's most likely stolen. So here the Brisa says that you're not allowed to buy them from them in that circumstance from the back of the garden, but you are allowed to buy from the front of the garden, where it's considered to be before Hestia. Right, the Gemara quotes a Maimer. When are you allowed to buy from a gazlan, somebody who is a person who often steals, his reputation for being a thief? When are you allowed to purchase things from? So the Gemara says when a majority, the Gemara has two opinions. Going to the first opinion, which is Rav, when a majority of the possessions that he owns belong to him, you could assume that what you're buying from him is the Rav. Shmuel says even if it's a minority, you could assume that it's from the minority. Well, the concept of Talia, you can be Toile, that as long as he has enough to be able to be selling you what he's selling you properly, you could assume that what he's selling you belongs to him. The Gemara records that Rav Yehuda said to his Shamish, the Gabbai, his name was Ado, he said to do like the one who says you're even allowed to buy if the thief only owns a minority of the possessions that he has under his control. Now, what do you do with the property of a Meiser? Meiser is somebody who has the government or the Einstein, he points out properties of other Yidden for them to take away. So the Meiser, what do you do with his things? You're allowed to buy from him. What's the halacha? So Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda, the Machlokes, one says you're allowed to take his property and destroy it with your hands. You're allowed to punish him in that sense. And one says it's aser. What's a Machlokes? So the one that says that it's mutter holds that you're allowed to kill the guy himself. Maybe not directly to kill him, you're allowed to lower him in the bottom of a well and not bring him out. You're allowed to take the ladder away. So since you're allowed to kill him, certainly you're allowed to destroy his money. The one who says that it's aser holds you're not supposed to kill him either, because he may have righteous children, and it says Yachin Rasha v'tzadik Yobash. Now this is a pasuk in Eiv, but there you don't find the word Rasha. It just says Yachin v'tzadik Yobash. The Gemara is saying it Rasha. The Yachin is for the Rasha, that's the Rasha, and then the tzadik you can use. The Gemara now speaks a bit of Agadata on drushes related to some psukim related to this one here. The Gemara says Rav Chizda had an Aris who used to take one fruit for himself and give one fruit to Rav Chizda. Either that means that he was very exacting in the way he split it, or that he took 50%, while most Arisim take 25 or 33%. So Rav Chizda fired him, and he ended the deal with him, and then he called a pasuk on his action, what it says in Mishlei, V'tzafan l'tzadik chel l'chaytei, that the tzaddik rids himself of the sinner, and that's Rav Chizda who got rid of this Aris who he did not approve of his actions. Next, Gemara quotes a pasuk in Eiv. It says, Kimat tikvas chanef. What is the end? What is the final hope of a thief? Ki yivtza, ki yesha alika nafshef. And that's what she steals. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu will will take away his soul. Shmuel says, who's this his? So whose soul? The thief is saying that the soul of the thief will be removed, or the soul of the victim. So the Gemara says machlekes. Rav Huna and Chizda. One says the soul of the thief, one says the soul of the victim. It might doesn't specify which one is which. The one who says the soul of the victim, because it says in a different pasuk in the Mishlei, Kain Archais Kol Batzei Abatza is Nefesh Ba'alav Yikach. That's the way of all people who steal. They take away the soul of the owner. So you see, it's reflecting the concept that by stealing, one deprives the victim of his own soul. And the one who says that it's the soul of the thief is a pasuk for that also. Also in the Mishlei it says Al Tigzol Do Kidalhu. Don't steal from a poor person, even if he's poor, even if he can't resist. Val Tadaki Ani Bashar, and don't oppress the poor people who are collecting the matnas aniyim at the gates. Don't oppress any of them. Hashem Yorav because the Kadosh Baruch Hu is, this is the next pasuk, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu will fight their fight, v'kavas kaveim nefesh, and he will kava kaveim their soul. That sounds like he will steal from them their soul. That means the Kadosh Baruch Hu will take away the soul of the gazlan, of the thief. So I ask, what are they each going to do with each other's psukim? So the Gemara says, what's with nefesh ba'alav yikach? It does say that the thief is taking away the soul of the victim. So the Gemara says, what does ba'alav mean? It means the current owner, the owner meaning the thief. That the stolen property will cause the thief to lose his own soul. And this is, what does the other one do with the passage where it says Hashem will kava es kaveim nefesh? So it says, it's not saying what Hashem's going to do, it's saying the reason that Hashem will get involved. Ki Hashem Yariv Rivam. Why will Hashem fight their fight? Because the kavas kaveim nefesh, because the thief took away the nefesh, and now it's referring to the nefesh of the victim. On a similar note, the Gemara brings a maimer from Rav Yechanan. Anybody who steals from a friend, even one shavar pruta, it's like he took his soul from him. And the Gemara brings three psukim to support this. First of all, like it says, "Kain archas kol beitzei ambatza es nefesh ba'alav yikach." The pasuk we just brought before, when somebody who steals is taking the soul of the owner. Second pasuk it brings from Yirmiyah. It says, "Achal kitzircha v'lachmecha." They'll take your harvest and your bread. Yechel b'necha v'neisecha. Yechel tzancha v'karecha. Yechel gafnecha v'seinesecha. Yeroishish ari mevtzerecha. Asher ata b'techa b'hina b'charv. So it calls someone who takes the katzir and the lechem. Yechel b'necha v'neisecha is destroying your sons and your daughters. The third pasuk the Gemara brings is that it says Mitzrayim l'shma matiyah ve'edom l'midbar shma matiyah, that Mitzrayim and Edom will be destroyed mechamas b'nei Yehuda, because of that they stole, or they did chamas from the b'nei Yehuda, asher shafchu dam naki ba'artzam, and it calls it that it spilled innocent blood in their land. The Gemara actually brings a fourth pasuk. It says in Sefer Shmuel, v'yirav b'mei David shalish shanim, there was a famine in the times of David HaMelech for 3 years. Acher Shana, Yevakish David Espnei Hashem. David asked Hashem, what's it about? V'yamar Hashem, Ol Shaul v'El Beis Hadamim, Asher Hamas is the Gevainim. It's about Shaul, that he killed out the Gevainim. The Gemara is going to explain soon. He didn't kill the Gevainim, he killed Never Kahanim, who were supporting the Gevainim, and therefore deprived the Gevainim of their sustenance. And that's, the Gemara is calling that like he's killed them. The pasuk is calling it like he's killed them, and therefore we're comparing and we're seeing that stealing is on the level of killing. Now it says the Gemara, why do we need all these psukim? What does each one add to the one before? So the Gemara says the first one just shows that it's like he kills the victim himself. How do you know that it's like he kills his children? That's therefore you have the second one where it says banav of Naisav. Now, if you just had those two, you would think that's only if he takes without giving anything in return. But what if he pays for it? What if he does chamas? So if you have the third pasuk which talks about chamas, and then the fourth one adds, even if he didn't do it himself, even if he just caused it, like Shaul, who never killed the Gevainim, but he did wipe out Never Kahanim, who were feeding the Gevainim, and therefore it was a grama for their loss, but still it counts as if he was Hargan. The Gemara now refers back to the Mishnah. Last halacha at the end of the Mishnah, we had seen that you're allowed to buy things from women, certain items that you can assume that they have permission to sell. They're not selling something that belongs to their husbands. So we're close to Bryce on the topic. The Gemara says you're allowed to purchase from women woolen clothing in Yehuda, flax clothing in the Galil, because in those areas they are made shluchim for the husband to sell those things. However, you're not allowed to buy wine, oil, or flour. You're not allowed to balsa. You're also not allowed to buy other things from avadim or from children, because they don't own them. They belong to the husband's fathers or masters, and they don't traditionally make the women, the children, or avadim shluchim to sell those things, so they must be stolen. Abishol says she is allowed to sell a small amount. She's allowed to sell 4 or 5 dinar worth. That the husband is not makbid, and she uses it to buy a head cloth. Now, the Mishnah then says further, anyone who says, hide the deal, you're not allowed to buy from them because that's a sign that they're a thief. The Brisa here says that if he's a guy by tzedakah, he's collecting for tzedakah, he's allowed to take a small amount from them because that's not necessarily going to be stolen, but should not take a large amount because that would be stolen. However, people who have an olive press are allowed to take a large amount of olives or oil, but not a small amount of olives or oil. And the reason there is because now large amounts are considered to be b'farhesia, and therefore it's not likely that it would be stolen such a large amount. Now, Shimon ben Gamliel disagrees a bit, and he says you are allowed to purchase from them a small amount in Galil Ha'elyon, because sometimes a person wants to sell, he only wants to sell a little bit, but he's embarrassed to sell by the door of his house, so he gives it to his wife and makes her sell them. The Gemara quotes an incident. Ravina went to the place of Mechuzah. The women of Mechuzah came to give tzedakah to him. He was a tzedakah collector. They gave him bracelets and necklaces. He accepted it from them. So Rabbi Tisfa asked Ravina what happened to the Brisa where we said that the guy tzedakah is only allowed to take small things. He's not allowed to take large things or big expensive things. So he answered, this jewelry for the people of Mechuzah who are very wealthy is considered to be a small thing. We're now in the last Mishnah, which discusses scraps of material that are left over or pulled out when a worker is working on the Baal Bayis' material. Who's allowed to keep those scraps? And the general rule will be if it's something significant that belongs to the owner. If it's something insignificant, then the worker can take them. So the Mishnah says that little balls of thread or fibers of wool that the washer pulls off in his washing, he can keep those because they're small. However, the ones pulled off by a comber are much larger, and he has to give that back to the Baal Bayis. The washer is allowed to take 3 threads that are at the end of the cloth. She says those 3 threads were put there for him to be able to take and straighten out the cloth. If there's any more than those 3 threads, they belong to the Baal Bayis. And if it's the wrong color, so it makes it ugly, like it's black on a white cloth, then he can take them all and keep them. Now, a tailor who has extra thread that he can use to sew, or he has an extra bit of cloth that he cut off to even things out. If it's 3 fingers by 3 fingers, then they belong to the Baal Bayis because they are significant. A carpenter who cuts off wood chips in his work, he can keep the wood chips. However, if it's things that he smooths out by planing it off, that he has to give back to the Baal Bayis. Now, if it's in the Baal Bayis' rishus, and he's working in his rishos, he didn't bring to his own shop, and he's working in his own shop. He's working in the property of the Baal Bayis as if he's working as a hired worker, not as a person who was assigned to do the job, but he's assigned just as a hourly wage. Then even the sawdust he has to give back to the Baal Bayis because he's keeping all of that. The Gemara brings a brisa which has similar halachas. Some are different, which we'll have to compare and resolve the contradictions. The brisa says you're allowed to take balls of wool that come out in the washing because they belong to the washer. He's allowed to take 2 threads from the edge of the cloth. Our Mishnah said 3. That belongs to him. Now, when combing it out, they make loops. They make stitches in the cloth to stitch them together on the end so that they can comb them out. And then they have to take them out and pull the threads back straight. So you shouldn't make more than 3 of those stitches, and you should not comb the cloth to widthwise. It should only be lengthwise, and should be stretched out to its length, but not to its width. And if he wants to even it out, up to 1 tefach, he could only cut off 1 tefach wide in order to even it out. So the Gemara goes through it. So the Gemara says, first of all, it says 2 chutin, 2 strings on the edge. We learned 3. The Gemara says, not akasha. 1 is referring to where you have large strings. 1 is talking where they are small. Then you can take 3. Shouldn't comb it. Shesi, you should only comb it. Here, the Gemara says we have a brisa that says the opposite. The Gemara says not akasha. 1 is talking about where it's weekday clothing, it's worn all the time. 1 is talking about where it's Shabbos clothing, it's for special occasions. So one of the ways makes it prettier, but more likely to rip and tear and wear out. So if it's one for fine occasions, do it the pretty way. And if it's one that's going to tear and wear out, then you should not. If it's one that you will use for everyday use, you should not do it in a way that's going to make it more easy to tear and rip. The Gemara says you shouldn't put in more than 3 loops or extra stitches to hold it for the work. So Rabbi Yirmiyah asked, what do you mean by 3? When you say a stitch, so you make the stitch by pushing the needle through the baguette and then back the other way. Does that count as 1 or as 2? So can you do 6 of those, 3 in and 3 out, or is it 3 total, including the ins and outs? So Mara says, Teiko will leave that unresolved. Next, the Gemara asks, we said that you should even it out, cut off to make it even along the length, but not along the width. Mara says the Brisa says the opposite. So Mara says it's not a kasha. It depends what type of clothing you're wearing, a glima or a himyana types of clothing, and one of them the length was visible, and one of them the width was visible. So you straighten out the end which is visible. Next, Brisa says you're not allowed to purchase the fluff balls from the washer, from the comber, because the comber is not allowed to keep them, therefore they are stolen in his hands. Gomer says, but if he got so many that he used it to stuff a cushion, you're allowed to buy the cushion from him, because now that's a shinoi, it's a new thing, and therefore it belongs to him. Gemara now quotes a Brisa about what you're allowed to buy from a weaver. What can you assume are his, and what are you not allowed to buy from him, because they're not his. So the Brisa says you're not allowed to purchase from him Irin, Nirin, Punkulin, Shiri Pekiois. These things are the loops that are put at the end of the stick that holds the ball of thread they use to go back and forth to make the weave. Those are the Irin. Nirin are the strings of the weaving loom itself that raise and lower the loom when it's being operated. The next thing are the balls of thread themselves, and the last one is the thread that goes back and forth. So any of these things you're not allowed to buy, because he's not allowed to keep them, and therefore they are not his, would be stolen. However, what you are allowed to buy from them are a spotted cloth. That's a completed cloth, which you can assume is his, even if it's a patchwork of much smaller cloths that are sewn together, which it looks like he stole scraps, but you're allowed to, because again, it's a shinoi. And you're allowed to purchase from him, even if it's spotted in the chassis or in the erev, or if it is spun together, or if it's woven. All these things are a shinoi. He took the threads, he spun, he wove. These things become his, and you're allowed to buy them from. So, Kasha, if you're allowed to buy spun, certainly you're allowed to buy woven. Weaving goes after spinning. So, my answer is it's possible to spin without weaving. It's possible to weave without spinning, and that's if he wove the fibers in their natural state together without first making them into thread. Now, Abraisa says, what about someone who is a dyer? His job is to color cloth or threads. So you're not allowed to purchase from him because he probably stole it. The following objects. You're not allowed to buy scraps that he uses to test the coloring to see if it'll absorb it properly. You're not allowed to buy samples that the owner of the cloth brought to show him this is the color that I want. And you're not allowed to take scraps of wool that would have been plucked from the ball of wool itself. However, you are allowed to buy a completed cloth, a colored cloth, or a colored thread that he spun or that he sewed together pieces of cloth to make a larger one. Somewhere it says if you're allowed to buy the spinning, certainly you're allowed to buy the larger one because that involved spinning. Or it says no, it could have been made by felt, where the entire thing is flattened and steamrolled without ever being spun. Now, somebody who works leather, you are allowed to purchase from him the threads which float to the surface when he soaks them in the water, that the Bava Kamma is not makbid on. However, the trimmings that he cuts off the edges and the wool which he pulls off the skin, those things he's not allowed to take. Now, the Mishnah said if there are black threads on the edges that are left there, he's allowed to take those off. More quotes Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the washer is called a kitsara because he's allowed to cut off the edges. He's allowed to make it a little bit shorter, and he takes those from the word katzer. He also said that those threads count towards the shear of space you need from the tzitzis to the edge of the cloth, and he says that his son Yitzchak was makbid on them. Now, the next phrase in the Mishnah, we had seen that if the sewer, the tailor, leaves over thread that's enough to sew with, then he has to return that. So how much is that shear? So Ravasi says it is the length of the needle and a little bit more, because you need that amount to be able to push the needle through and pull thread. Otherwise, there isn't enough space for the needle to fold on the edge and go into the cloth. So Mara asked when we said a little bit more, do we mean a full needle's length more? So you need 2 needles length or just a needle length plus? So Mara quotes a brisa, says that the tailor who leaves over from the chut and a little and less than the amount that he needs to that he has to have to be able to sew with it, or if he has a scrap of cloth which is less than 3 by 3, so if the Baal Bayis is makbid on it, he still has to return it, even though we said that he can assume he's allowed to keep it. But if the Baal Bayis is makbid, he has to return it. If the Baal Bayis is not makbid, he's allowed to keep them. So Gemara says, if you mean the length of a thread plus a little bit more, there's no way to be makbid on that. It's totally useless. There's nothing you can do with that. So it must mean twice the length of that thread. Now, if it's 2 needle lengths, what's it useful for? It's useful for the procedure where you sew them together as part of the combing process, as we said before. However, less than that, you can't even sew, so it can't be useful for anything. Now, further analyzing the Mishnah, we had seen that the wood chips that are cut off, the carpenter is allowed to keep. As a contradictory brisa, it says that the wood chips that are cut off, what's called matzad, or chunks of wood that are trimmed off when you cut a piece of wood shorter, these belong to the Bava Kamma, not like our brisa says that the chips belong to the worker. Anything that comes out of the drill or under a saw, or that's used to fill in holes, so these are all sawdust, these sawdust belongs to the worker. So it's a stira. Rava answers, it depends on where the brisa is. Our brisa has 2 types of wood chips. The big ones he calls kashil, the small ones he calls matzad, and therefore it means the small ones, and that's why he's allowed to keep them. But this brisa here, he only has 1 type, and he calls them all matzad, and he's referring here to the large ones. Okay, last line in the Mishnah had said that if you're working in the property of the Baal Bayis, then everything belongs to him, you can't take any of it. So we're called to brisa. People whose job is to square off bricks, there is no theft for them if they take the shavings. People who prune branches off trees, or people who clear out thorn bushes or weeds from between them, people who hoe up vegetables in order to make space. There's too many that are crowded together, and all these, it depends if the Baal Bayis is makbid there, then it would be theft to take them. If the Baal Bayis is not makbid, then you're allowed to keep them. Rav Yehuda says kishus, a type of bean, and chaziz, which is grain that's cut short, eaten by animals. There's no gezel on those. But he says if it's a place where people are makbid, then there is gezel there. Ravina says masa machasi, there are a lot of animals. They feed these to their animals, and there is hakpada, and it would be theft to take them. Hadron Allah Masachas Bava Kamma Hadrach Alon.